and in this video we are going to learn about Caedmon and Cynewulf and their contribution to English literature. But their contribution to English literature is something that is so vast that I probably cannot incorporate all of that in one video. So this video is going to be just an introductory video where we are going to learn about who Caedmon and Cynewulf were, and in the next video I'm going to talk about their works in detail. There are many works and I probably have to make separate videos for Caedmon's works and Cynewulf's works, but in this video we are just going to get a glimpse into who these two people were and what is their importance when it comes to English literature. So let's start with Caedmon. Caedmon is supposed to be the father of Old English poetry. Yes, that is how important he was. He was supposed to be the father of Old English poetry. Caedmon was illiterate, he did not know how to read and write. So how did he become the father of Old English poetry? Now it is said that whatever he learnt was through word of mouth, and whatever he composed was due to divine intervention. Kemp Malone, the author of The Literary History of England, Kemp Malone, here you can see his name, and I'm going to refer to this book when I'm talking about Caedmon. So according to Kemp Malone, Caedmon was an elderly farmhand from Yorkshire who had no idea how to compose verses and who at entertainments would flee due to embarrassment when his turn came at singing. Now this man, he suddenly began to compose verses, a kind not hitherto known in English. Like, the verses were totally different and they were mostly religious verses, and the themes were drawn from the Holy Writ, which means the Bible. Now keep in mind that Caedmon's verses were mostly based on themes and stories from the Old Testament, not the New Testament. Now, who was Caedmon before he started composing these religious verses? First of all, he was what we might call a lay brother. Now, who is a lay brother? A lay brother is someone who has taken the vows of a religious order, but who is not ordained or bound to the divine office. He was chiefly employed in manual labor. After that, he served as a monk in a monastery, the Whitby Monastery, under the abbess Saint Hilda. His literary activity falls between the years 657 and 680. Most of his works are found in the Junius Manuscripts. Now, I've already discussed in my previous videos about the 4 major manuscripts that you have, which contain the entire Anglo Saxon literature that we have today. It's all there in the 4 manuscripts, and the Junius Manuscript is just one of them. So most of Caedmon's works you're going to find in the Junius Manuscript. We have a detailed account of Caedmon, who he was and how he came to compose religious verses, in Saint Bede's work Historia Ecclesiastica, which is also known as the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. There you find a detailed account of who Caedmon was and how he came to compose religious verses. Now, the Historia Ecclesiastica is a very, very important and one of the primary sources when it comes to our understanding of how the Anglo-Saxon people were converted to Christianity. Now, what is the story of Caedmon that we have in Historia Ecclesiastica, composed by Bede? So, it happened that one night at an entertainment, when Caedmon's turn came at singing, naturally he fled due to embarrassment, and then he went back to where he lived and then he slept it off. And in his dream, he met a stranger. A stranger appeared to him in his dream, and that stranger told him to compose religious verses. And after he woke up from the dream, he went and narrated this entire thing to Saint Hilda, who was the abbess of the Whitby Monastery. And that's how he started composing religious verses, like all of a sudden out of thin air, just because of that dream. So he was inspired by that dream, and that is why scholars often refer to as divine inspiration, an inspiration that he received in his dream and that propelled him to, create an entire tradition of Old English poetry, the religious poetry. Now, most of the works that we have in the Junius Manuscript, yes, they are attributed to Caedmon, but the poems that we have under the manuscript are most commonly referred to as poems that were written under the school of Caedmon. Now, what is the school of Caedmon and how is it different from Caedmon himself? So, the school of Caedmon means that we are not exactly sure whether Caedmon himself wrote these poems, but these poems were composed by the host of Northumbrian school of poets that Caedmon brought into being. So we do not know whether Caedmon himself wrote these poems, but it definitely meant that these poems were written by the host of Northumbrian poets who Caedmon brought into being. We find in these poems elements that we find in Caedmon's poems as well. Now there's one more thing that you need to keep in mind, and that is most of the Anglo-Saxon literature that you have, especially the Anglo-Saxon poetry, their sources, who wrote them, how they came into being, it's all very ambiguous. It's under a lot of doubt, and no one can be 100% sure that Caedmon wrote this poem or Cynewulf wrote this poem. Now, things are a little bit different for Cynewulf, and I'll tell you how they are different when I come to Cynewulf. But as far as Caedmon was concerned, his scholarship is still under a lot of doubt. Caedmon's first poem was called Hymn, and Bede gives us a Latin translation of this poem afterwards. Now, what is the subject matter of this poem Hymn? Just like a scop sings the praises of his Lord, Caedmon also sings the praises of God Almighty. This is basically what the entire poem is about. Now, some of the themes that Caedmon wrote on were the origin of mankind, the creation of the world, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and their entry into the promised land. He also talked about the horrors of hellfire. He talked about the terrors of the doomsday. He also talked about Christ's incarnation, passion, resurrection, and then his eventual ascension into heaven. So these were the themes that Caedmon talked about. He basically drew from the Bible. Some of the poems that are attributed to Caedmon are Genesis A. Now there's a Genesis B, but we are not sure whether Caedmon composed that poem or not. Most scholars agree that Genesis B was later interpolated and it's not something that was composed by Caedmon. But Genesis A is generally attributed to Caedmon. Then there's another poem, Exodus, which is about, the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt to the promised land, which I just talked about under his themes. So that is another poem. And then we have the poem Daniel, and then there's another poem, Christ and Satan. So these are the major works that are attributed to Caedmon. Now let's move on to Cynewulf. Like I've already told you before, most of the Anglo-Saxon poetry that we have are anonymous. We do not know who wrote them, but there are a few specific poems, and we are absolutely sure that Cynewulf authored those poems because Cynewulf had this habit of signing his name on the poems that he wrote, and that is how we know that Cynewulf is the composer of these poems. Now, his signatures were mostly in the form of runic inscriptions. What else do we know about Cynewulf? We know that he was an Angle. And how do we know that? We know that primarily based on a few linguistic evidences, that is the way he used certain words, the kind of dialect he used while writing his poems. He mostly switched from Northumbrian to the Mercian dialect. A few minutes ago I've talked about Caedmon, and his literary activity stretched from the 657 to 680. But Cynewulf came like one generation later. So his literary activity, usually falls between the late 8th century and the 9th century, continued way into the 9th century. We do not know much about his life, but whatever we know about Cynewulf or whatever we have inferred about Cynewulf are mostly from his works. Now, some scholars have identified Cynewulf with a certain Cynewulf who was the bishop of Lindasferne and who lived in the middle of the 8th century. But we do not know for sure whether he is the one who has written all of these poems. Cynewulf basically was a wandering singer, kind of a scop, you can say, who wrote very realistically about battle scenes and seafaring. For a very long time, the poem Dream of the Rood, I have an entire video explaining the content of the Dream of the Rood, which you can check obviously. So for a long time, scholars believed that the Cynewulf had authored the poem The Dream of the Rood, but later, recent scholarship, they completely dismiss that idea. They attribute the poem neither to Caedmon nor to Cynewulf. Some poems attributed to Cynewulf are Juliana, Elene, The Fate of the Apostles, Christ 2. These are the poems that directly bear Cynewulf's signature on them. Other poems like the Guthlac, Andrea's, the Phoenix, Bestiary, they all fall under the Cynewulfian school. The main difference between Caedmon and Cynewulf was the fact that Caedmon usually drew his themes from the Old Testament of the Bible. Most of his poems were episodes directly taken from the Bible, but Cynewulf mostly wrote about the lives of saints, the apostles, and his poems were based on didactic themes. Another difference between Caedmon and Cynewulf is that Caedmon was illiterate as far as we know, but Cynewulf was not. In fact, Cynewulf's poems show a lot of artistic skill and craftsmanship. So we can conclude that Cynewulf was not illiterate. He was quite well versed, he was quite learned. And if you go back directly to probably my first or second video, you'll know that most of the Anglo Saxon riddles that we have, they are attributed to Cynewulf. Now I shall describe these riddles, I shall talk about them in more detail in my next videos, and definitely I'm going to talk about the major works of Caedmon and Cynewulf in the videos that are about to follow this video. But for today, this is where we end. I hope you liked this video. I hope you learned something new about Caedmon and Cynewulf. Now this was just the introduction. We shall delve deeper into the works of these two poets. So stay tuned for that. And if you've benefited from my videos, definitely do subscribe to my channel and leave your comment below. And share my videos with your friends who might be students of English literature or who might be literature enthusiasts, so that they might benefit from these videos as well. Thank you. Have a nice day.